Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Jared Pratt, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Corporal Meg Reeves. Tomorrow marks the commencement of a new sitting year for the 46th Parliament of Australia. We pause here in the commemorative area of the Australian War Memorial and reflect on the political, economic and religious freedoms afforded to us as Australians. These freedoms are underpinned by those who serve and have served our nation in the Australian Defence Force. At the opposite end of Anzac Parade from the Parliament, this institution and the stories it tells remind us of what it means to be Australian. We are committed to one another, our nation, and the ideals of mankind. Here with us today are the men and women elected by Australians to make the decisions that build and protect our nation, including the deployment of members of the Australian Defence Force across the globe. The roll of honour, cloaking us, reminds us of the cost of those decisions, as does the physical and emotional toll on those who have served. As the members of Parliament commence the sitting year, your presence here speaks to every Australian, whether by birth or choice, of the deep responsibility to never forget individual sacrifices made in our name, devotion to duty and our country. We thank you for your commitment and service, which reflects the essence of the Australian spirit, a spirit that we also showcase here in stories at the Australian War Memorial. Shortly, we will hear the story of Lieutenant Bartholomew James Stubbs, who lost his life while serving Australia in the First World War. We're honoured to acknowledge the Honourable Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Leader of the Federal Opposition, and all members and senators of the 46th Parliament of Australia who are joining us this evening. We're also honoured to acknowledge General Angus Campbell, Chief of Defence Force, and members of the Australian Defence Force. Mrs Sharon Bown, representing the Chairman and Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Mr Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those who are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. Australia's Federation Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier within the Hall of Memory.
Shoulder.
I'd now like to invite the Honourable Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, to the lectern.
Australians one, Australians all. We meet today on the ancient land of the Ngunnawal people, one of the many First Nations people who have cared for this country since time immemorial. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I honour also all the servicemen and women who are here with us today and their veterans, and I thank them for their service to our country. We're gathered in what I like to refer to our nation's most sacred place. A monument to all who have served, a shrine to those who are lost, and a solemn landmark for those of us who serve the Australian people in Parliament. The vista of those who visit Canberra always points to Parliament House, a shining reminder of our liberty and freedom. But our vista as parliamentarians points to this sacred place, an ever-present reminder of how our liberties and our freedoms were won and paid for, especially by those whose names line these walls. Flanking the entrance that we walk through today are those two stone lions. They are proud symbols of Australia's war history and a gift from the mayor of the people of Ypres in Belgium. For decades, these lions stood at Menin Gate in Ypres. During the First World War, Australian Allied troops in their thousands marched through this gate on their way to the front. For many, it was their point of no return, the final mark of civilisation before the mud and the mayhem of Passchendaele. One of those who had walked through the Menin Gate was 45-year-old Second Lieutenant Bartholomew James Stubbs. He enlisted for service in early 1916 and was described by a Duntroon classmate as a brave, capable and conscientious officer. But he wasn't only serving his country on the battlefield. While he was fighting on the Western Front, he was also serving as the Labor member for Subiaco in the Western Australian Legislative Assembly, a soldier legislator. While he was in service, his constituents offered him a unique honour. On the 12th of September 1917, Second Lieutenant Stubbs was re-elected unopposed, appropriately, for the seat of Subiaco. But just 2 weeks later, he was shot and killed by a sniper during the Battle of Polygon Wood. You will hear more about that battle later. The then Western Australian Premier said of Stubbs, he heard a call that was greater than the call of party. He certainly did. He wasn't our only soldier legislator either. Others heard a call greater than the party also. Lieutenant Colonel George Brand, the son of a merchant, was from the Conservative side of politics, the Liberal Reform member for Armidale in New South Wales Parliament. He was from the bush and he was passionate about cutting taxes. From that same Parliament, Sergeant Ted Larkin, the son of a coal miner and the Labor member for Willoughby, also signed up. Larkin was from the city and a proud socialist. These men came from very different backgrounds and wore very different political stripes, and they fiercely contended for their beliefs. Yet somewhere between Sydney Harbour and Albany and Egypt and then Gallipoli, they discovered that what they had in common mattered much more. Like Second Lieutenant Stubbs, they too made the ultimate sacrifice, falling at Gallipoli, two of our original Anzacs. The Sun newspaper wrote of them. They were elected and stood on the threshold of public careers, the limits or ends of which it was impossible to foresee. There was no place in the public life of Australia that was not open to either of them. Like all who serve, forsaking thresholds without limits for the country they love. It is right that we visit this memorial at the start of our sittings to hear that voice of our country, to be reminded of our duty and our sacrifice, and the thresholds forsaken for us, and to be reminded, in the words of a modern soldier turned legislator, of our responsibility to uphold the men and women who run to the sound of guns and who, through their physical and moral courage, protect us all from harm. Colleagues, but especially veterans and friends, years after the entranceway at Menin was destroyed, a memorial gate was built. That gate bears the names of 50,000 Allied soldiers who were killed in the vicinity of Ypres and have no known grave. Among them are 6,178 Australians, including 2nd Lieutenant Stubbs. The memorial was inaugurated in July 1927 by Field Marshal Lord Plummer, who comforted the relatives of the missing soldiers with the words, "He is not missing, he is here." As we gather today at the Australian War Memorial, we can say the same. They are here. The 102,000 men and women whose names are on these walls, they are here with us, their names and their memory, part of the soul of our nation in this most sacred of places. Their memory carries on from generation to generation, so later, as the bugle rings out and we quietly look down Anzac Parade towards our home of democracy, let us recommit ourselves to live up to the example that they have set before us, lest we forget.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I now invite the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Leader of the Federal Opposition, to the lectern.
I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. To Matt Anderson, the Director of the Australian War Memorial, to Sharon Barron, representing the Chairman of the War Memorial and a member of its council, to Vice Chief of the Defence Force, Vice Admiral David Johnson, Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Michael Noonan, Chief of Army, Lieutenant General Richard Burr, Chief of Air Force, Air Marshal Mel Hupfeld, and to Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and to all my parliamentary colleagues, and a particular welcome to all veterans who are here and serving members of the ADF represented here this evening. As a sequence of musical notes, the last post does not place great demands on the bugler, but its simplicity is deceptive, masking a power and an eloquence that resonates within us all. It calls on us to remember. It calls on us together with the spirits of the fallen. It calls on us to contemplate the magnitude of the debt that we owe them. And it urges us to reaffirm our vow that we will never let them fade. This memorial, this secular temple of memory, but at the same time such a spiritual place, is a place where we hold on to the lessons of history, suffering, courage, sacrifice, victory, loss. This building and all that it holds stands as a stark reminder, as eternal as the flame that burns within it. A reminder of the long and terrible cycle of wars. Those who went, those who never came home, those who never came home the same. The soldiers, the sailors, the air crews, the doctors, the nurses, the engineers, the mechanics, the cooks, the chaplains who went to provide spiritual support, the journalists who went to strike history's brutal first draft. Our nation has stood against darkness and won, but darkness is not vanquished from the world. Freedom is not something that we can keep carelessly, nor is freedom free. We gather here to remember those who have paid its price. But there are holes in our memory that we need to fill, not least the Indigenous soldiers who went and fought. Those first Australians who donned the khaki and left their homes to fight for a nation that at all times wasn't prepared to fight for them. A nation that didn't treat them as equals, not when they went, not when they returned home from distant battlefields. Yet they went. They fought for a continent that had been the home of their people for a long, unbroken chain of millennia, the longest existing continuous civilization on the planet. They died protecting their loved ones. They died protecting their way of life. They died for their country. We must remember them just as we remember all those who fought more recent foes. When this war memorial opened in 1941, the calamity of World War II was only months away from coming over our horizon and reaching our shores. On that day, Prime Minister John Curtin said that this place would bring us closer to the meaning of all this courage and sacrifice and faith, all of which would be desperately needed in the coming years. And he said, this memorial belongs, like the capital city itself, to all of Australia. Just as it belongs to us, so do the responsibilities it places upon each and every one of us. This place reminds us that even in the greatest darkness, we must never stop seeking the light. I often turn to two of the great examples with which our national parliament has been graced. Tom Uran, my mentor, my friend, a father figure and a giant of the Labor Party, and Sir John Carrick, who I met up at Kanchanaburi at Hellfire Pass, Tom's comrade and a giant of the Liberal Party. Both of them were Australians who in war saw the worst of humanity and were forever after driven to seek out its best. They held up the past to us and in doing so held out the hope of a better future. That is the spirit that brings us here together, to remember, because there are some things we cannot afford to repeat, to remember those who have gone before us to protect what we had, and thanks to them, still have, and to remind ourselves that the way of life we have is not something we can take for granted. With the ground once again shifting beneath our old certainties, the act of remembering takes on greater importance. And that is why we hold in our hearts those precious three words, lest we forget.
Thank you, Mr. Albanese. If able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
History's
The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection in the following order. The Honourable Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, and the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Leader of the Federal Opposition. The Honourable Tony Spitt, Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Senator the Honourable Scott Ryan, President of the Senate. The Honourable Darren Chester, Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel, representing the Minister for Defence, and the Honourable Brendan O'Connor, Shadow Minister for Defence. Mr Bert Van Mennen, representing the Minister for Defence Industry, and Mr Luke Gosling, representing the Shadow Minister for Defence Industry. The Honourable Shane Newman, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel, and Ms Meryl Swanson, Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence. General Angus Campbell, Chief of the Defence Force. Mr. John King, President, RSL ACT Branch. Mrs. Sharon Bown, representing the Chairman and Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Mr. Matt Anderson, Director, Australian War Memorial. Earlier today, a wreath was laid on behalf of the Honourable Andrew Hastie, Assistant Minister for Defence, who was unable to attend today's ceremony.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Second Lieutenant Bartholomew James Stubbs. Born in Bendigo, Victoria, on the 31st of May 1872, Bartholomew Stubbs was the second son of a mining manager, William Stubbs, and his wife, Catherine. Known to his family and friends as Jim, Stubbs attended the Christian Brothers School in Bendigo, after which he became an apprentice tailor. Through this work, he joined a trade union and was introduced to the Labor Party. In 1894, the 22-year-old moved to Perth, where he ran a tailoring business in Subiaco. It was here Stubbs met the widow Alice Rewell, whom he married in 1897. He became stepfather to Alice's 2 children, and in 1905, the couple also took in Alice's 5-year-old orphan niece. Stubbs became steadily more involved in workers' rights and conditions. In 1896, he had been a founding member of the Perth's Tailor Society, which eventually became a trade union. For some years, he worked at Kalgoorlie, and on his return to Perth in 1911, Stubbs was selected as a Labor Party candidate for the seat of Subiaco and won the 3 October election by a narrow margin. According to the Speaker of the House, the new member proved to be an able, earnest and conscientious parliamentarian who, among other things, had fought to promote humanitarian social measures. His skills in oratory were considerable, as were his powers of persuasion. At one speaking event in 1913, he was praised for his moral courage in convincing his own supporters to let their opponents have their fair say. Stubbs became well known and admired in his Subiaco electorate and was seen as a generous benefactor to local charities and organisations. Having been a keen sportsman in his younger days, he now represented the Subiaco Football Club on the committee of the West Australian Football League. Stubbs was re-elected 3 years later, by which time the world had gone to war. A strong supporter of the Allied cause, Stubbs initially served on a recruitment committee and spoke on numerous occasions encouraging men to join up. Yet he also felt the responsibility to lead by example. He was well above the maximum age for enlistment in the early stages of the war, but by mid-1915 it had been raised to 45. At 43, he could now enlist. Having urged middle-aged men with children or other ties to volunteer before the young married men, Stubbs now followed through. Enlisting on the 14th of February 1916, he was allotted to the 8th Reinforcements for the 51st Infantry Battalion, a largely Western Australian battalion. After basic training, Stubbs attended the Royal Military College at Duntroon and was commissioned a second lieutenant in August 1916. Leading the reinforcements, Stubbs embarked in Fremantle aboard the troop ship Berrima on the 23rd of December 1916. 8 weeks later, they disembarked Plymouth Harbour in England. For the remainder of February and March 1917, the troops were put through their paces at the training battalions on the Salisbury Plain, while Stubbs attended an officer training school. Towards the end of June, Stubbs was sent to the front in Belgium. On the 3rd of July, he finally joined the 51st Battalion, but there would be no more training in store as the battalion prepared for a big offensive. By the summer of 1917, 3 years of fighting in France and Belgium had resulted in a bloody stalemate. There seemed no end in sight as casualties continued to mount. Few places on the Western Front were as dreaded as the Ypres sector in Belgium, but it was here that the Allies would make a big push against the Germans, who seemed invincible, lodged on the Passchendaele Heights. The offensive began at the end of July, but despite good early progress, German resistance soon hardened. The 51st continued training well to the rear of the lines, and Stubbs took the opportunity to get to know the platoon he was now leading and prepare them for battle. In early August, he sent a cable confirming he would run again in the upcoming state election. On the 12th of September, Stubbs retained his seat unopposed. While serving in the army, he donated his parliamentary salary to charity. Now came time for the 4th Australian Division, to which the 51st belonged to play their part in the Great Offensive. As exhausted divisions were pulled out, fresh ones came in to keep the attack going. On the 26th of September, the Battle of Polygon Wood commenced. Protected by a massive artillery barrage, the 51st Battalion advanced at 5:50 a.m. and had easily captured their objective by 8 a.m. As the men consolidated the position, it appeared casualties had been remarkably light. But that day, the 51st suffered a total of 124 casualties, about a quarter of them killed. Among the dead was 2nd Lieutenant Bartholomew James Stubbs. Having led his platoon of B Company forward, Stubbs and his men were digging in on the objective when an enemy sniper found his mark. Hit in the chest, Stubbs fell dead. Stubbs was buried near where he fell, but like so many others in this devastated battlefield, his remains were never recovered. His name therefore appears on the Menin Gate Memorial to the Missing in the town of Ypres. He was 45 years old. The battalion CO, Lieutenant Colonel Ridley, spoke highly of Stubbs. He had endeared himself to everybody, officer and man alike, with whom he came in contact with, and his one desire was to take part in some actual fighting at the head of his men. Word of Stubbs' death reached home around the 6th of October, where the news was received with widespread regret among all sections of the community, particularly in parliamentary and trade union circles. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember 2nd Lieutenant Bartholomew James Stubbs, who gave his life for us, our freedoms, in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
Party shoulder.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
Catapult party present. Arms.
lest we forget.
Colour Party out words! Turn! Colour Party quick! March!
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozieres, or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the last post ceremony. We thank you all for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.